When talking about communication cultures, we generally talk about 5 different phases. The 5 phases are the spoken culture, the written culture, the printed culture, the audiovisual culture, and the multimedia culture. We usually distinguish the different communication cultures because the purpose of them are very different. Each culture can be used to present something in a specific way. The first ever culture was the spoken culture. From the beginning of time, human beings communicated via the voices because they didn't have any other way to create contact with one another. The spoken culture has always been, and still is, the most used way to engage in social communities and contexts. Any society is affected by the oral culture since it is a very engaging form of communication. Looking back in time, the spoken culture was used primarily to create contact to other people, but it was also used to deliver short messages fast. Traditions and tales were all retold verbally and therefore also changed and adjusted as to when and where they were told. But one thing always remained the same: the moral. The moral of the story was always the same, no matter what other words were being added to or taken away from the story. In general, the spoken culture is very dependent on one's memory and ability to memorize details. A story or message can quickly get a whole other meaning if it isn't retold as intended. This is also a great risk as to how other people understand and interpret the given message. Although it can be risky to memorize a message, the spoken culture has great possibilities too. For instance, it is a lot easier to use emotions in a speech than it is to write them down. When making a speech, the voice itself is used, and it makes it easier for the audience to know exactly what one means and feels. It also makes it a lot easier to identify with a statement. The second culture is the written culture. This culture has also evolved throughout time. In the beginning in the Nordic countries, it was the runes that were used, but around year 1000, the Latin alphabet became more accepted in society and was also used more. The written culture requires material tools, unlike the oral culture, which only requires the ability to talk and hear. To communicate through writing requires both something to write with and something to write on. The point of the written culture is that the communication and the message can be preserved for a long time, possibly forever. A lot of the knowledge that we as humans have about the past come from writings about and from certain time periods. Not only does the written culture make sure that a message gets delivered as it was meant, it also ensures that some things always remain the same and are never to be interpreted. Deals, scriptures, laws, and rules are examples of the power that the written culture has. Since it's written down, it's always to be enforced and maintained the same way it was from the beginning. Writing the laws on paper makes them more powerful. The written culture contributes to a more complex society. The third phase of communication is the printed culture. This culture mainly focuses on printing a piece of writing in a bigger quantity. This is done mechanically and became possible in the 15th century in Europe. In the beginning, it was primarily Holy Scriptures that were printed, but when the technology became more secure and well known, more people used it. As the printed culture included books and newspapers, the world also became more addicted to knowing what was happening. As it became more popular, it also created a need in the world that hadn't been there before. The printed culture also brought along a brand new possibility to mass communicate with the population. Mass communication is defined by one sender and an anonymous, possibly infinite audience. The point of the printed culture is to distribute a message fast. It was suddenly easier to get information faster, but it also had a downside. The wealthy people with power all of a sudden couldn't control what kind of information was being printed. It wasn't easy for them to withhold rumors or bad things happening. The printed culture has helped the world modernize itself and become a well-informed and educated society. The fourth phase of communication was the audiovisual culture. This is the phase where picture and sound play the main role. Printing illustrations alongside text became very popular. In the beginning, it was drawn illustrations, but then along with the camera came the photographs. Photography was used to immortalize certain moments. At first, it was only used by wealthy people, but then later, when it was possible to print the pictures in the newspaper, it became more normal to have pictures in the articles. The ultimate climax of the audiovisual phase was the film. It is now possible to have moving pictures showing a series of moments. Later on, the sound plays a big role too. In the 1920s, the record player, the radio, and the sound film were popular, and then lastly, the television in the 1950s. The last phase is the multimedia culture. This is where the previous phases melt together and create one media together, the computer. The computer has both writings, sound, and moving pictures digitalized. You can easily access anything you want whenever you want it, and that is what characterizes the multimedia culture. Not only the communication cultures changed, but also the purpose and method changed. In the beginning with the spoken culture, the communication was face-to-face with a known sender and a known receiver or audience. The books were each directed to a certain type or group of people, and often written to make the reader specifically relate to the book. Later, with the newspaper, radio, and TV, the audience became anonymous. You can't tell how big the audience is. Suddenly, the communication wasn't meant for a specific person or group of people, but whoever comes across the media, whatever it is. It went from two-way communication to one-way communication, and then at last to mass communication.